James, so glad to talk to you about the movie.
As I as well. Thank you.
I don't know how you pulled it off, honestly, because it's such a tricky moment in time. Bob Dylan, but you've pulled off a lot of difficult things before. So I wanted to start by asking you, there's a pivotal scene in the movie when they go see Now Voyager. Now Voyager feels like it's about transformation. They talk a little bit about that. Betty Davis is also a figure, I think, who represents a certain amount of like artists going after the artist's truth and stuff. Can you tell me about the intention and if there's that and more and how you kind of chose to make that focal point throughout the
Well, they go see this, they go to a revival theater, Elle Fanning's character and Timmy's character, Bob Dylan. And it Now Voyager, for the film fans, for the people who call themselves film fans, if you haven't seen it, you should.
Yeah.
It is a movie about a woman who kind of remakes herself, rebuilds herself,
Right.
changes the course of her life by kind of escaping being under the thumb of a domineering mother, but also kind of liberating herself somehow from the identity she had been carrying. And of course, I don't need to explain that that had relevance in the sense that Bob, too, kind of left Minnesota with $1 in his pocket and a guitar case and a moleskin notebook with some lyrics in it, renamed himself and landed in New York City and kind of gets another chapter, a new chapter, or writes a new book as a new person. And so that movie inspires a kind of small conversation between Sylvie and Bob that that shows that he's kind of sensitive about the way someone might talk about a transformation like that, but also I think just brings up the idea of a kind of change in your life. And it's such a theme of Bob Dylan's life,
Sure.
both in this film, but also it continues. You know?
And you brought up brilliantly that it's about where he's been. It's referencing that he's already changed, but it's foreshadowing the big change, or one of them. But the
one of
that's in
them.
the
I mean,
story.
I think that the story of his whole life is a series of these changes and reinventions of oneself. And he not busy being born is busy dying. And
Right.
there you go.
Yes, there's a lot of relevant lyrics. Speaking of one of my favorite songs ever of his, "It Ain't Me, Babe," beautifully done in the film. I always thought it was about a relationship. There's a suggestion to me that I got the first time ever that it was also about a relationship with the role he was being given. The folk hero, literally, or the political figure. Can you talk about the ideas of the changes, the idea of him saying, I'm not that guy, I don't want to be that guy. You being an artist yourself who has reinvented yourself, gone through changes, picked different types of projects. Like, I know there's a lot there, but it's fascinating to me.
It is fascinating, and it's a fascinating subject. And part of, I think, what makes Bob's writing so powerful is, in a sense, also its porousness. It's that you can see it as allegory, you can see it as a relationship song, you can see it as a political manifesto, you can see it so many ways because of what he says and what he doesn't say. And that is really interesting to me. In terms of, our movie tells the story of a young man who arrives and soon becomes a kind of a sensation in the folk music world. And but that isn't to say that that was what all or everything Bob Dylan dreamed of being, as established early in our film. And as I actually learned from Bob himself, he, arrived in New York, and as much as he worshiped Woody Guthrie, he also loved Buddy Holly and Little Richard and Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash and Hank Williams, and these people had bands.
Yes.
And so he never quite saw himself in the kind of tribal, dogmatic way that some of the folkies did.
Yes.
As it's this or nothing. Everything else is invalid or untrue or corrupted.
And you didn't. The movie does such a good job establishing that. Right when we meet him, he says things like, I don't like labels, or why are you labeling this, or like you planted it perfectly. We know it's coming, and that conversation, you know.
And I, you know, in my own modest way, I do identify with it. I mean, my entire career, which has been a while now, I really enjoy changing what I'm doing. I don't think I change myself, and to that degree, I don't think Bob reinvents his core soul. But I like to throw myself into things that people don't expect, or that I don't expect, more importantly, in terms of surprising myself or challenging myself. The other thing I think that's so important when you get to work, because honestly, it's partly about luck. I've been afforded the chance. I can work in different genre because people will finance it. And you know, if I was just a horror director and people only wanted to pay for my horror movies, that would be a different problem. But the part of the joy is that when you are changing genre or the vernacular, some of the way you communicate in your art, is that you learn a lot. You know, I've learned a lot, whether it's making an action film, and there's things you learn bringing it to a musical film, or whether it's making a Western and bringing those energies to kind of superhero film or Marvel film, that you not only learn things making one genre, but then you learn how to carry over lessons from that genre into one that you might not expect it.
I love that you've done that and you say that. If I had all the time in the world, I would ask you about Logan, for example, which crushed me. I remember seeing it in the theater, expecting one thing, and like crying with like the Shane references, because you Western, right? Like you bring all this stuff into it. And I want to ask, because, you know, one thing people say you're going to do next is something like a Star Wars, a DC, you know, those things come with almost as much or more complications as talking about Bob Dylan, right? Like they're loaded.
Do.
How can you, and just, I hope you find a way, but how can you find a way to play in those worlds creatively and deliver on all the levels? Just like Bob Dylan has to push back against like all the producers, all the figures, all the powers, and the audience. You're gonna do that next, I'm sure. Like, so how do you?
Well, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I mean, to me, the two aspects that are really important is the freedom to make something new, which, you know, Bo and I, in relation to Star Wars, have been working on a script, and we'll see what happens. And in relation to like Swamp Thing at DC, again, it's just a matter of, do we find a way on the page to say something original? But part of the reason, you know, the Star Wars movie would be taking place 25,000 years before any known Star Wars movies take place is because not only it's an area and a playground that I was inspired by as a teenager, but also I'm not that interested in being handcuffed by so much lore at this point that it's almost immovable and you can't please anybody.
Of course.
Yeah.
And yet you were handcuffed to actual historical events here, and you and Timothée found a way to honor the events and Bob, but also craft something new as well. Like,
that's so true.
You know?
But the reality is that it's not. You still have with Bob. You have known quantities, yes, but there's a lot of ways to interpret them. With other kinds of IP, it gets, well, you could say this about Bob, it gets to a near religious level. No, there is no interpretation but this interpretation. But that could be said of Bob Dylan fans, and frankly, I honestly think you can succeed or you can fail. Success is never guaranteed, but the reality is that the way most often to get the most, you can never get everyone to agree, but to get most people to agree is to move them, is to somehow find the humanity in a situation. You know, the reason, whether it's whichever it is, mega franchises or smaller dramatic movies, whatever it is, usually the movies you remember are the ones that move you. And the ones that leave you cold, even if they're clever, even if they're spectacular, even if they're dazzling, somehow just become replaced by the next dazzling object a year later. And that it's the feelings that it's the feels, right? That really define how we feel about these movies and whether we care to visit them again, which is what makes us know that they are still there, you know, that keeps them alive over time.
Thank you so much for doing this.
pleasure.
And you've certainly moved me in your movies, so
Well, thank you, man.